Thanks for having me today and this whole week. It's been a lot of fun, and I've enjoyed talking with you. So I'm going to talk about a couple things today. First, I'm going to give a just quick overview of kind of how I see the digital humanities, the different activities that I see in that area, and then I'm going to start talking about some questions that I think are important to consider in this area. So no answers, but some questions that I think are good and helpful to think about. But I want to start by saying just a little bit about who I am and where I come from, because I am a bit of a strange digital humanities person. I have a master's in a humanities field in English literature, and I do work that looks like digital humanities using digital tools to look at cultural objects, but my PhD is from an information school, kind of an interdisciplinary place that tends to be more like social science. And so for my dissertation work, I was using methods like interview to look at the work of digital humanities scholars. So I'm sort of half inside this space, half outside looking in at this space. So this is my perspective when I talk about these things. Okay, so a brief overview of digital humanities, and this is just sort of my perspective on them, kind of my map of the digital humanities. And one of the things that I'm going to be emphasizing today is that there's a lot of activities inside this phrase, digital humanities. So one thing that people do and call digital humanities is use digital tools to analyze the same objects that humanities scholars look at other times. And lately this is being called either cultural analytics or distant reading. And then, at least for me, a distinct activity that other people are doing and some of the same people are doing is building tools to do this. So not using the tools to analyze cultural objects, but actually looking more like a computer scientist and developing the tools that are being used. And I've kind of put on the borders here some disciplines, some fields that these activities interact with. So a lot of this work over here ends up looking a lot like computer science sometimes, and they'll read computer science texts and draw on those. A lot of times it looks like machine learning or what's starting to be called data science. And it also looks a lot like computational social science. And we'll draw on a lot of the same techniques and be in conversation with those areas. But a lot of digital humanities work, what gets called digital humanities, is also not using digital tools to analyze objects, but using digital tools to preserve, archive, or curate objects, creating maybe digital editions of literature, or maybe doing 3D modeling or these similar activities to make cultural objects accessible to people, to organize them in different ways. And there's also work within digital humanities that isn't using digital tools, but is actually looking at digital objects as the object of study. And so this would look a little bit more like what we might think of as media studies. And I kind of note over here that some kind of disciplines hanging around the margins here would be information science, my own field, science and technology studies, sort of a more sociological approach to some of these questions, as well as media studies. So I want to give a few examples of each of these just so that we kind of have some idea of what I'm talking about. Using digital tools to analyze objects. This was a project by a few scholars, and what they wanted to do was look at Thomas Piketty's claim that money disappears in the 20th century literature. And so they said, okay, well, we can actually look at all of these novels, and they show that references to money actually increase over time, looking at all of these novels. A more popular example, an analysis of the vocabularies used by different rap or hip hop artists. So showing kind of the vocabulary density or the extent of the vocabulary used by people and comparing it to, say, Moby Dick or Shakespeare's works. So a popular example. Building tools, there's not a lot of pretty pictures, but this is a package of software released by a guy named Ben Schmidt that just makes some computational processes available to humanities scholars. And some people in the class that I've been teaching are very excited about this tool, Voyant, which some scholars made and released, and it lets you analyze text in different ways. If we think about creating digital editions, preserving, archiving, curating objects, this was a project that I did that shows 2 different editions of a book of poetry by Lynn Heginian and lets you go through and just see what changed between the years and kind of explore that. The archaeology people and some people in those related realms are really interested in 3D modeling, and so they're doing things like recreating objects that no longer exist or objects that are held in museum collections and letting people maybe print out their own versions so that they can have a different experience of those objects. So, and then when we talk about using non-digital tools to analyze digital objects, this is a project by Lauren Klein, and she's looking at the history of data visualization, right? So she's just looking at these old things and thinking about them in much the same way that a humanities scholar would. Similarly, this is Alan Liu's book on knowledge work and kind of the cultures of information work, right? Where he's not using digital tools, but he's looking out at digital culture and just talking about it. So to kind of emphasize how diverse some of this work is, I pulled courses that are being taught, I think this year, at a thing called Digital Humanities Summer Institute. It's just a big get-together where they teach a bunch of classes, students come, and within this digital humanities grouping, you have courses as diverse as doing text processing, but also doing digital storytelling, using Drupal, which is a content management system for making web pages. You have a course on electronic literature, but also things like palpability and wearable computing. Right, and so I'm just kind of trying to show the diversity of what falls under this heading and is actually being taught currently in this space, right, like a history of textiles. So it is very recognized within digital humanities that there is this diversity and that there are a lot of things going on. So Lauren Klein and Matthew Gold a few years ago write, in what has been called Big Tent DH, it can at times be difficult to determine with any specificity what precisely digital humanities work entails. DH in this vision appears suspended between, among, and through a range of forces taken together and perceived together, these vectors structure the expanded field. Tom Scheinfeld writes, eventually, digital humanities must make arguments. It has to answer questions. But yet, maybe we need time to articulate our digital apparatus to produce new phenomena that we can neither anticipate nor explain immediately. At the very least, we need to make room for both kinds of digital humanities, the kind that seeks to make arguments and answer questions now, and the kind that builds tools and resources. Right, so these are kind of arguments that, okay, this is okay for now. We're going to let everybody live in the big tent. And then Matthew Kirschenbaum has also said, this phrase, digital humanities, it doesn't really describe a field. It's a tactical term. It is a useful term that people can use to get funding for their work, to get tenure lines. This is a term that we use, and it doesn't actually so much describe an identifiable area of study. And so what I want to kind of turn to talk about now is how within this big tent, within these many different things that people are doing, digital humanities scholars are still articulating their methodologies. I think this is one of the things that at least I see going on within the field right now. And when I say methodology, for me, my definition tends to come out of sociology. I tend to borrow from a guy named Burrowoy here, but I think about this as what comes between data and theory, your theory of how knowledge is produced. But I want to, since we're talking about digital humanities, Also, recognize that methodology is not a phrase that's used terribly often within the humanities, and instead, what you find more often are very implicit ways of doing work that aren't necessarily made explicit or aren't necessarily articulated in the same way that they are in other fields. So I've interviewed lots of digital humanities scholars, and for a while one of the things that I was interested in was looking at all the different ways that they use these words like method and methodology, and how these words actually mean a lot of different things to these people, just because ways of doing work are so implicit in the humanities, so kind of just ingrained and learned over time. But Tanya Clement, my advisor, has argued that articulating methodology gives us an opportunity to explain why we do what we do, which in turn allows us to argue for the specific contributions of our findings to ourselves, to other humanists, to those possible collaborators in other disciplines who rely on methodology as a signpost, and to the world, right? So Tanya's here arguing that digital humanists should articulate their methodologies, and that this would lead to better work, better collaborations, and a way to do this interdisciplinary work. And I'm also going to try to make the point here that articulating methodology is also important because it would help us understand how to teach digital humanities students, and it would help us kind of make more definitive statements about what we should teach to digital humanities students, which I think is still an ongoing debate and something that lots of people are thinking about. So Ted Underwood has said, I enjoyed teaching digital humanities courses, but if I'm being honest, it was a challenge to race from digital editing, to maps and networks, to distant reading, to critical reflection on the concept of digital humanities itself. It was even harder to cover that range of topics while giving students meaningful hands-on experience. So, trying to cover all of those yellow squares that I put up there is very difficult. So I'm going to go through kind of a series of questions here, a series of things that I want to think through as a way of thinking what methodology might look like in the digital humanities, and why thinking about it might be useful. So first, I think it's worth thinking about or asking whether digital humanities is about using digital tools, whether it's about analyzing digital culture, or as some scholars have suggested, whether it's actually about doing both at the same time. So if we think about using digital tools, there are now journals like the Journal of Cultural Analytics that are explicitly about this form of digital humanities. And they're explicitly not looking at digital culture, right? These are historical letters, and they're using digital tools to look at them. This is another project where they're just using digital tools to look at the history of the novel TM project. This is a project that's using computation to look at whaling voyages from, I think, the 19th century, right? So this is kind of one very distinct way of working. But we also have things that we call digital humanities, like Matthew Kirschenbaum's book Mechanisms, which just looks at digital materiality. He's interested in what digital objects are. Some people might be familiar with Catherine Hale's work. Catherine Hale tends to just think about digital culture, but she's not using algorithms, she's not using machine learning. The same with Alan Liu's work. But there's also a strong line of argument within the digital humanities that makes the case for doing these things at the same time, and makes the case that these two practices reinforce each other. And this is something that I think, personally, I'm still kind of working through and thinking about, and others as well. So Alan Liu writes, in both their promise and their threat, the digital humanities serve as a shadow play for a future form of the humanities that wishes to include what contemporary society values about the digital without losing its soul to other domains of knowledge work that have gone digital to stake their claim to that society. He goes on, the appropriate, unique contribution that the digital humanities can make to cultural criticism at the present time is to use the tools, paradigms, and concepts of digital technologies to help rethink the idea of instrumentality. The goal is to think critically about metadata and everything else related to digital technologies in a way that scales into thinking critically about the power, finance, and other governance protocols of the world. Phrased even more expansively, the goal is to rethink instrumentality so that it includes both humanistic and STEM fields in a culturally broad and not just narrowly purposive ideal of service. So Alan Liu thinks that using digital tools is a way to think critically about digital society. And this is an influential argument. Another reformulation of it, Ryan Cordell writes, in such a DH, computation would not be simply a powerful modern tool applied to the past, or equally simply an impoverished neoliberal framework incommensurate with the nuances of the past. Instead, computation would be both subject and methodology, both way of working and thing that's being looked at, both of history and capable of dialogue with history. More robust historical contextualization can, I believe, assist on all sides of the DH debates, mitigating both the millennial and apocalyptic rhetoric swirling around the field. So he's reiterating what Liu said. So Scott Selisker, again, Alan Liu is influential in this space. There's a lot of people responding to Liu here. Says, I think Liu is suggesting that getting our hands dirty with digital tools puts us in a position where our meta-commentary can produce fresh insights about the forms and technologies of knowledge in the contemporary moment. I like this notion because it suggests that the main benefit of humanists using big data, for example, is not simply some well-mapped and well-ordered fingertip command of all the data of culture. Rather, what we get is a more robust understanding of big data as an idea and as a cultural phenomenon, an understanding that comes from trying to square this new form of knowledge with humanistic strategies of thinking. We've had enough quotes. Let's skip Andrew Piper. So we have this strange idea that using digital tools is a route to doing cultural criticism, and that these things are going to work together. And I think one thing that's important to think about in relation to that goal, as people I think are still trying to figure out how to do this, right? There have been a lot of suggestions that people do this and less examples maybe of how it's done. And so I think it's important to think about and to remember that humanists are still actively negotiating between their unique goals and values and these tools, these digital tools that are made by computer scientists. Because humanists and computer scientists tend to think about the world in somewhat different ways. And a good example of this is the concept of ground truth. So computer scientists, people doing machine learning, tend to assume that there is a ground truth in the world, that I can maybe say, this is a picture of a cat, or this is not a picture of a cat, or this is an example of the Gothic genre, and this is not an example of the Gothic genre. The sentiment of this sentence is +9, the sentiment of this sentence is -4. Humanists who take a more hermeneutic approach, a more interpretivist approach, will likely say the sentiment of that sentence might be something like +9 for you. It may be different for you, and what matters is our interpretive process or our process of interacting with this cultural object. So what I'm getting at here is that there is a struggle to use these tools and to figure out how to use these tools. We talked about that. So Ted Underwood says humanists have struggled to assimilate a series of innovations from computer science. And I'm just trying to show here how aware humanists are of this tension. Jeffrey Binder says that text mining is an alien form of reading, right? It is not our humanist form of reading. It is this alien thing that comes from the outside. Johanna Drucker, really bluntly, says research instruments have been absorbed from disciplines whose epistemological foundations and fundamental values are at odds with or even hostile to the humanities. And then one of my favorite quotes from some interviews that I did, a scholar of rhetoric said, "We've just been screwing around in the garage with the instruments that Dad left in there." And I like this quote because it's very much, we found these tools. We are doing things with them, but we're screwing around. We're not doing the same things that Dad would have done with them. So this question of how to use these tools, how to do this work, is ongoing, and one answer that people have put forth is that maybe what we need to do, maybe what digital humanists need to do, is adopt other fields' methodologies. Other fields have used these things, maybe we can use them the same way. So this was an exchange on Twitter that happened just a couple days ago. And Ryan Heusser says, DH-style pattern recognition is new and important, but it remains a first step in the same broader hermeneutic circle of cultural criticism. Right? So, okay, these tools are great. We can do things with them, but we're still doing hermeneutics. We're still humanists. Ted Underwood, who is interesting because he has a PhD in, I believe, both literature and statistics, says, I know what you mean. Having a road doesn't make it illegal to go off-road, but I'd also stress that social scientists have been over this. None of these issues are fresh and new and purely or even mainly about the encounter of humanists with machines. Right? So the argument here is, okay, we don't have to make up methodology. Social scientists already know how to do this. They know how to do these tools. Let's not waste our time. They're right. We'll do it that way. So this is one idea kind of being bandied about. Another answer that people have put forward is, let's just use these tools really strangely. Let's not adopt methodology at all. So this is Stephen Ramsey's book, Reading Machines, and he introduces this concept of deformance or screwmeneutics, or just like screwy hermeneutics, where we're just going to do things to text. It's going to change text, and this is great because then we have a new perspective on text, right? This is totally don't adopt methodology from social science, from computer science. We'll just do some weird things. It's an interesting book. But neither of these seems completely right, and most of the people involved, I think, acknowledge that neither of these is completely right. So again, Ted Underwood, who was arguing for, let's adopt social science methodologies in some contexts, also says to turn social scientific methods into literary history, his field, you have to connect the results of a model meaningfully to an existing conversation about the literary past. For that, you need a lot of things that aren't contained in the original method: historical scholarship, critical insight, hopefully embodied in good writing. Social scientific methods can only become literary history in collaboration with libraries. This is from another interview that I did, and the scholar says, thinking about cultural data, where you start with an assumption that text can have different kinds of associations, different kinds of meanings, that interpretations are going to see different things. Agreement studies, that's a core practice in computer science, so you measure the degree of agreement between coders on some phenomena, and that gives you some idea of your ground truth. My intuition is the things that we study are going to show very low levels of agreement. And the question is, what do we do then? So it's kind of saying, if we do things like the computer scientists do, they're probably not going to work, because people probably aren't going to be able to agree enough on the sentiment of a sentence or whether this is an example of the Gothic genre for these same methodologies to work. And I think an idea that I'm playing with and that I want to kind of talk about in this context is that digital humanities scholars are maybe trying to be both inside and outside of normal digital practices or normal practices in other spaces. They might be trying to be both on the road and off the road, as Ted Underwood was saying. So I want to kind of talk through a few of these ideas. And one way that I've been thinking about this is through the concepts of literacy and fluency. And I'm still playing with these ideas, so I'm very open to people's ideas about whether this makes sense or not. So in the literature, we usually talk about literacy as knowing how to do something in the same way that everyone else does it. So in the United States, the government will say promote information technology literacy, and that means we want all of our citizens to be able to use email, to open a Word document, to save that document, right? We want some base level of understanding. We want everyone to be able to do the same thing. And I think, for me, this is kind of what people like Salisker and Liu are talking about. He says, I think Liu is suggesting that getting our hands dirty puts us in a position where we can produce fresh insights about the forms and technologies of knowledge in the contemporary moment, right? So doing these things gives us access to what is normal within digital culture, within information work, within these realms that these digital humanists would like to do cultural criticism. And he's kind of saying, well, if we actually do it, then we experience it and we have a ground from which to produce our cultural criticism. And I think one way of expressing this is saying that, we gain literacy. We gain the same literacy as everyone else has or as these other information workers have. And kind of as I'm formulating this is maybe about putting yourself in a position to know from the inside. If I'm studying information work, I'm going to do information work. But as someone who comes from information studies, from a very interdisciplinary field, this sounds a lot to me like what anthropologists do, like what ethnographers do. You go out, you get inside something, and you look at it. So Caitlin Zaloom's book about day traders, stock traders, right? She went and worked as a stock trader. She observed these people. She got inside and talked about it. Gabriella Coleman's book on Anonymous. It's a digital ethnography. She interacted with and was to some extent a member of Anonymous in order to do cultural criticism about these things or to present a view of these things from the inside. But in the literature, literacy is usually contrasted with fluency. And fluency is more or less defined as the ability to do something in a new way or in a personally meaningful way. So instead of saying we would like all of our citizens to be able to send email, this is saying, we would like people to be technically fluent enough that they can solve their own unique problems using information technology. They can create new ideas out of information technology, and they're not only doing the same thing as everybody else. And Gerhard Fischer is a computer scientist who has thought about fluency. He writes, fluency with IT is defined as the ability to reformulate knowledge, to express oneself creatively and appropriately, and to produce and generate information rather than simply to comprehend it. Fluency goes beyond traditional notions of computer literacy by requiring a deeper, more essential understanding and mastery of IT, and is a prerequisite to creating a personal and deep relationship with data. He goes on, and I include this quote just because I think it's actually fairly relevant to the digital humanities. The monopoly of highly trained computing professionals acting as high-tech scribes should be eliminated, just as the monopoly of the scribes was eliminated during the Reformation in Europe. This does not mean that there's no place for professional programmers and system designers in the future. It does mean, however, that one of the most important objectives of the professional computing community should be to create systems that will put owners of problems in charge. So here, the acquisition of fluency is liberating. It allows you to escape kind of the ways of doing work or maybe the methodologies of people who have different values and goals that are distinct from yours. And so kind of in the way that I'm thinking about it, this idea of fluency is about getting outside of some space in order to produce knowledge differently or to do meaningful work, personally relevant work. And so I want to give two examples of how I see fluency working within the digital humanities. So this is a scholar that I interviewed quite a bit, looked a lot at his work processes, and he's using digital tools to look at the relationship of concepts in the 17th century, I believe. And here he's describing his goals, his values, and he's kind of comparing them to the goals and values of other fields. So he says, I believe that in the end, classification produces a lot of digital humanities findings, like the computer can do this, or genre does exist, and he's denigrating this. He's saying this is boring. It's sort of about their ratification and concept's existence, but again, it's just not as playful. And he's saying, I want my work to be playful. If I do things like the classification people do them, like the computer scientists, like the machine learning people do them, I get these things, but what I want is something playful. Okay, so he's being pretty clear here about how he wants his work to look. And if people have read computer science texts, they look like this. And this is sort of my example of what computer science looks like sometimes. And he's using the same tool that is used in this paper. He's using Word2Vec, which is kind of this recent-ish machine learning algorithm. But his work looks like this. And what I'm trying to show here is that he's using the same tools, but he's using them in fairly weird ways. He's doing very different things with these tools than what computer scientists do. So here he's created a network graph of concepts within this period of literature. so that he can kind of group them himself, right? He's not clustering them using an algorithm. He's not getting a list of these clusters. He's actually sometimes quibbling with the clusters that Gephi gives, right? So Gephi will give you clusters, but here he says, no, this one's not that. That's an aristocratic value, right? He's drawing on things. He's doing something that's much more interpretive than other people would use this same tool to do. Here he's doing something similar, but without getting into it, he's using the value of r squared very strangely here. And r squared is a measure of goodness to fit. Computer scientists, statisticians use this. And he's using this same number, but he's using it in a very strange way here. And so I look at these as examples of fluency, as examples of kind of understanding these numbers, understanding these models, understanding these data structures to the extent that he can do something weird with them, something that he values. He would say, this is playful, I like this. And I've seen him present this work, and it goes over very well with humanists. Just another quick example from a couple rhetoric scholars that I was interviewing. These guys use digital tools probably in the weirdest way of anyone I interviewed. They are like making up their own ways of doing topic modeling. They're doing some really weird stuff. And here they're talking about how for a while they'd been kind of working with themselves and like, I don't really know what we're doing. Is this working? And then they basically told me, then we got up the courage to go and sit down with a computer scientist and show him what we were doing. And so they told me the first time this happened was when we sat down with the computer science guy who does natural language processing and who wrote a book on Python, and we showed him, and he flipped out. He's like, oh my God, you guys, that is so awesome what you're doing. We're like, well, wait, what are we doing? And they said, it's fascinating. We started to get some traction, and we thought, okay, maybe there isn't an orthodoxy to respect here. So they're basically describing this moment where they realized, at least to themselves, okay, maybe we don't have to stay on the road, maybe we can get off the road and still go interesting places. And I've also watched these guys present, and these guys are, they're well respected in their field. And I'm kind of coming back to that because, what we think about as good work is going to come out of that, right? So I think it's useful to kind of use these concepts of literacy and fluency or on and off the road to ask, is digital humanities about being on the road or off the road? Do digital humanities scholars need literacy? Do they need to understand how other people are doing it? Or do they need fluency, which is kind of this other practice or this other way of relating to information technology or digital tools that lets them do some of the work that I've been looking at? Or do they somehow need both of these things? Which is maybe kind of what Lou might be asking for without completely suggesting, right? Asking to do both of these things at the same time. This might be another way to think about it. And as I said, one reason that I think it's important to articulate methodology in this way is that it helps us maybe think about what we should teach students in this field. Because I think there's a good amount of agreement that digital humanities students need domain knowledge. If you are studying the 18th century, you probably need to be an expert in 18th century literature. But there is some disagreement over whether digital humanities students need to learn to code. I tend to agree with Richard Jean So. He says, there are a couple things I want to say about coding. The first is that if you want to work with data or cite data, to me it is untenable to just hire or collaborate with someone in stats or computer science. To me, this actually seems anti-humanist because you don't understand what you're doing. This would be like hiring someone to go to the archive to do your research for you. To do a critical applied version of DH, you should learn how to code. Not because coding is a good practical skill, but because it's just solid humanities research practice to understand your materials and how they're made. But again, this is talking about one version of digital humanities, and when I say I think people should learn how to code, I'm also talking about one version of digital humanities. And articulating our methodologies might help us to say who needs to learn how to code and what kind of coding do you need to learn how to do. But beyond just kind of maybe the very difficult job of teaching students both domain knowledge and coding. I think there are open questions of, do digital humanities students need to know statistics? There's a lot of statistical work that I've shown on the screen today, but articulating methodologies and articulating exactly how the knowledge is being produced in different areas of digital humanities could contribute quite a bit to that. There's a lot of digital humanities that talks about design as something that students should need to know. And then if we are going to really follow through this line that Lou proposes of kind of getting inside digital culture as a way to critique or understand digital culture, do we need students to reach out to some surrounding disciplines? Do we need to introduce humanities scholars to things like ethnography as a way of providing a methodology or suggesting methodologies that might already exist for doing things that are similar to what they want to be doing? And I think it's important to realize that all of those things that I put on the board are probably impossible. So again, Ted Underwood's saying at most universities, graduate students still can't learn how to do distant reading, right? You still can't even learn how to do the domain knowledge plus coding part because the courses don't exist largely. So there's no chance at all that distant reading will become the next big thing. One of those fashions that sweeps departments of English, changing everyone's writing in a way that is soon taken for granted. We can stop worrying about that. Adding citations to Geertz or Foucault can be done in a month, which is maybe a questionable thing to say. But a method that requires years of retraining will never become the next big thing. Maybe 10 years from now, the fraction of humanities faculty who actually use quantitative methods may have risen to 5%, optimistically 7%, but even that change would be slow and deeply controversial. So even to do a few of the things that I've been talking about today, one small version of what is under this big tent of digital humanities, is this thing that from a pedagogical perspective or from kind of a practical perspective of within the institutions of learning that we have, what is possible, that is difficult without kind of even articulating and weeding out some of these other things that I've been talking about, right? And weeding these other things out might also let you say, actually, they don't need to do this. What they need to do is this other thing, right, that is either equally difficult or less difficult. So I want to kind of close my talk with a couple of questions, and I'm not answering questions in this talk, but I think it's worth considering whether this idea of a big tent, digital humanities, discourages scholars from articulating methodologies. Does the notion that we should preserve digital humanities as a very diverse, very interdisciplinary approach where we're going to let a lot of things live under the tent, right? Nobody says everybody under the tent is doing the same thing. They just say, okay, under this tent, everyone is welcome, right? And does that approach, which was really talked about more several years ago, does that approach discourage people from articulating their methodology, from saying, oh no, I produce knowledge in this way, and the way that I produce knowledge is different from the way you produce knowledge, rather than we're all doing digital humanities? And then I also want to think about whether this slow process, which I think scholars are beginning, of articulating the methodological divisions within digital humanities, whether that can be done while still retaining the tactical benefits of digital humanities, right? The tactical benefits of having centers, of having a place on campus where these things happen, of having tenure lines, of having hires that go across departments, of speaking maybe in a language that deans and provosts like, right? Administrators tend to like digital humanities for a number of reasons. And whether those tactical benefits can remain if we start saying, well, actually, we do different things. So these are questions that I'm thinking about and that I would enjoy talking with y'all about. So thank you for coming.